Well, hello there. Believe it or not, we've made it to week 10, the final week of this course. I hope you have enjoyed it. I have a couple of wrap up concepts I'd like to discuss with you in this week 10 video. Your chapter dealt with the internationalization issues related to the sector, and this is probably one of the most exciting times, I think, for nonprofit work and really any type of work if you're interested in it in terms of the globalization impacts. But as your chapter points out, obviously the world has become smaller, mostly because of technology, but also political, cultural, and economic realities seem to be driving us more and more together. The traditional name for nonprofits throughout the world are NGOs, and you will hear a lot of this, whether it's in war-torn areas or areas of developing countries. Usually the NGOs are among the first to go in. There's different types of NGOs, as your text points out. I'm not going to go into all of these, but it's kind of self-explanatory as you see on the slide. There's a lot of international philanthropy, especially in the U.S., especially in our area, dealing with Asia and the Pacific Rim, out here on the West Coast. And what often gets underlooked, but you've been hearing a little bit about in the political discourse lately, is the remittances, the money that people who work here are sending back to their countries, which some folks also view as a way in which we support the rest of the world. Global philanthropy has some issues in terms of the wealth in developing countries that is not there, the lack of history. Actually, what it's done is made it very competitive for those of us in the U.S. I write for some grants, for example, related to social enterprises that compete with people developing these concepts all over the world, and they tend to be more competitive, quite frankly. The governance issues are the same, the structural issues are the same. There's really not a lot of difference. So if you're interested in international work with your public administration degrees, nonprofit, NGO sector might be a place to think about. I also included in this some trends. This is an old trend from the 1970s, mega trends, and it always amazes me as I look back on this of how much of this has come to pass, the shrinking of the world, the globalization issues. These are some current issues that are impacting nonprofits. The devolution of the federal government, which we talked about back in the first session of the Lester Solomon article, increased competition, what's happening with charitable giving, motivation, client empowerment issues. Other issues, some of you started to ask these questions last week in terms of how can you deal with some of the financial challenges. And these are some of the concepts that I see as being important: diversifying, being community-centered, being technologically proficient, being able to form partnerships and collaboration, to compete, how? With an excellent workforce, and to also understand how to get supports for what you do and what your limits are. I spent much of my part of today negotiating a rather large contract to deliver senior meals and basically fighting for 1% on an administrative overhead, which is important. But you need to know that you need that 1% in order to fight for it. Some future trends, we got the largest cohort of seniors ever, the baby boomers, entering retirement age. And at the same time, we have the kids of the baby boomers having children. So we have a growth of kids, especially here in California, where Latino kids, Latinas, having babies. And here in the Inland Empire, we have one of the largest counts in the state in terms of babies. And that's why we do well with our first five funding, where we get $1 from every birth certificate. So there are some pluses to this, but obviously the dynamics, we have this continued pressure of kids versus seniors, and sometimes it's not pretty. One of the issues that some of you started to touch upon last week is, how do you shield yourself from a lot of these developments? Program diversification. You've got to diversify just like any portfolio. I have 45 different funding sources. It puts a lot of pressure on having to have very complex relationships, especially with government, but this slide kind of makes the case why it's necessary. And as I say, at the end of the day, it's the mission stupid, kind of like it's the economy stupid. It's always about doing more mission, and you do that by diversifying, not just by doing the same old, same old. I get called into a lot of organizations to provide consultation, and usually it's too late. They're trying to do the same thing that they've been doing for 50 years, and in this current environment, my approach is you grow or die, and diversification is the way you do that. Another approach is being community-centered, and this little circular presentation shows you how, as a direct service provider, you impact a certain smaller universe than if you start to expand out to being comprehensive, community-defined, and ultimately community-owned. So this idea of being community-centered is a concept that I have found to be very valuable, that you don't develop your programs. It goes back to our marketing discussion. You're not developing programs based on what you want the customer to want, but based on what the customers need and want. The other concept that I include in this kind of mixture of how you engage this new global and challenging world is asset-based community development. This looks at clients and communities in terms of the glass being half full, not half empty. I was trained as a social worker. I was trained to diagnose problems and prescribe treatment for folks. About 20 years into my profession, I realized that maybe wasn't empowering people. That was kind of putting band-aids on problems. And this concept, which sort of came to the fore in the early 1990s, captured my imagination and has helped me reorient programs and services to be asset-based, build on from what clients and customers have, not what they don't have. This is an asset map which shows that when you look at what people have, you start to see things, even in so-called depressed communities. There's always 95% of the people that have positive lifestyles, but the community gets defined by the 5%, as opposed to looking at it in terms of just the needs that are there. That's deficit approaches. And this book by Elizabeth Shaw, if you're interested, I gave you one of her chapters. I think a couple of chapters talks about the types of ways that people who work in human and people services get things to change. And she went around the country and surveyed all these programs and saw that they did some common things, such as being comprehensive and flexible and long-term, and looking at impacting, once again, beyond that circle of just the identified client out to the community. She identified that what was needed was a new practice and a new practitioner, being asset-based, being able to collaborate, being able to reconceive the professional role, and yes, a spiritual dimension, not necessarily religious, but someone who could transcend material need, to be both wizard and saint, to make things happen, but at the same time to be mission driven. The other slides that I provided for you were actually listed as Module 11, and you might not be able to read all of this stuff this week, but maybe over the summer you might want to think about this. This ethical chapter comes from a text that I use in the human development program at Cal State San Marcos, but this is a very interesting chapter. I hope you get to read it, and these are the highlights. You're going to be held to high standards in ethical behavior, and the bottom line principles are that you adhere to some professional code, you adapt to the cultural and social settings that you're in, and you become increasingly competent and respectful of the growing diversity that you're surrounded in. These are some concepts that I've always kept in the forefront of my mind when I think about being ethical and sustaining trust, as being having some sort of constancy, that people know what to expect, some congruity, that there's a relationship to the real world and what you're doing, that you're reliable, that you have integrity. These are the issues that most directly impact nonprofit organizations. The buck's got to stop somewhere, usually at the top, but sometimes all along the way. That you don't profit from the organization, that you're always honest, that you're open, as in real transparency, not just telling people what they already know or what they can figure out themselves, but really being honest, understanding, especially when you work in small local communities, that conflicts happen and you got to disclose them, that you honor privacy, that fundraising expects are reasonable, and that people are treated equitably. This is just, you may want to answer these questions and look at your ethical practices and principles, kind of survey them from time to time and see where you're at. And finally, as Peter Drucker in his book Post-Capitalist Society wrote, and this is why I teach these classes and I'm so passionate about the nonprofit sector, patriotism is a willingness to die for one's country. Citizenship means responsibility, means a willingness to contribute it to one's country. And he talks about how the nonprofit sector provides the glue that these other mega structures cannot provide. And I think that's why you're seeing some of these movements, whether it's Tea Party or Occupy or Feel the Burn or even the Trumpsters. You know, there's a yearning for some sort of glue that government is not doing the job. And in fact, Drucker writes that it's going to be these nonprofit local organizations that can provide the spirituality and passion and volunteerism and willingness to do good that will make the difference. The article from Poor Light talks about different ways that nonprofits might go in the future, a lot of which we have studied throughout this. And finally, here's my wrap up and why I hope some of you will choose the nonprofit sector to apply your public administration skills to, because you will have a skill set that is very applicable. So I hope what you have heard throughout these courses, that these are not a surprise to you, that nonprofits are a very American thing to do. They come out of our culture, that you need corporate cultures to empower people. Build from strength, be asset-based, diversify, position. Always remember the 3 C's: customer value, customer-centered, comprehensive. Think about being more entrepreneurial and innovation in driving your skill set, whatever sector you end up in. Remember that leadership is a combination of both vision and implementation. Be financially smart. Always understand that you're accountable, and at the end of the day, be effective and efficient. So I hope this course has opened your eyes up to some new possibilities. I hope it has been helpful. I have enjoyed it. It's always a challenge to do this online because there's a certain amount of interaction that I like to have in this concept, but I think we may have gotten there with all the different tasks. And I look forward to reading your projects, and wish you well in the future. If I can be of help, you know how to reach me.